In September 1950, a Navy ship sat just offshore of San Francisco and sprayed a fine mist into the morning air. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't fog, it was bacteria. For 6 days, nearly 800,000 people breathed it in, rode streetcars, ate lunch, and went home, never knowing they had become test subjects in Operation Sea Spray. The plan sounded simple: release a harmless microbe and measure how far it travels through a real city. The Navy even chose a bacterium that was easy to identify in lab samples, then set up collection points across the area to map how the cloud moved on the wind. On paper, it worked. The microbe traveled through the city the way a real biological attack might travel. The problem was the word harmless. About a week later, doctors noticed a strange cluster of serious infections linked to the same bacteria, and one patient, Edward Nevin, died. Whether every case can be proven in court almost doesn't matter. The ethical failure is obvious. The lab wasn't a building. The lab was the public. And the scariest part? Most people only learned about it decades later, meaning the experiment didn't just happen in secret, it stayed secret long enough to avoid consequences. Now here's the trick with secret experiments. Some stories are so wild they feel like proof that all the others must be fake too, like the Philadelphia experiment. According to the legend, the U.S. Navy tried to make the USS Eldridge invisible in 1943. The ship supposedly vanished, appeared miles away, then returned with sailors vomiting, missing, or even fused into steel. It's the perfect sci-fi nightmare. But the evidence collapses fast. The story traces back to strange letters written years later. The ship's records don't match the timeline, and the most likely real source was a normal process called degaussing, reducing a ship's magnetic signature. A hoax, almost certainly. But myths like this matter, because they train people to argue about the impossible, while the real abuses hide in plain sight. However, while people argued about teleporting ships, real experiments were happening that needed no special effects. In 1932, officials began the Tuskegee Syphilis Study in Alabama. Hundreds of black men were recruited with promises of care, meals, and burial insurance. They were told they had bad blood, not syphilis, and many were given placebos instead of treatment. Then the real betrayal arrived in 1947. Penicillin became the standard cure, and the study still continued. Treatment was deliberately withheld so researchers could watch what untreated syphilis does: blindness, organ damage, madness, death. When the truth finally broke in 1972, it wasn't a scandal about a mistake. It was a scandal about a decision. Secret science also wandered into places you'd never expect, like a rented apartment dressed up as a brothel. In the late 1950s, the CIA launched Operation Midnight Climax. Sex workers on the agency's payroll lured men inside, drinks were quietly laced with LSD, and agents watched through one-way mirrors, hoping to learn whether drugs and sex could loosen secrets. The setting was uncontrolled, the victims never consented, and the research slid into something closer to sanctioned abuse. It's hard to call it a failed experiment when the failure was the ethics. The results weren't clean science, just messy notes and ruined lives. And then came the case that still feels like a missing chapter in a spy novel. Frank Olson. In 1953, Olson, a government scientist, was unknowingly dosed with LSD at a work gathering. Over the next days he unraveled anxiety, confusion, paranoia, and he talked about quitting. 9 days later, he went out a 13th floor hotel window in New York City. The official story said suicide. Decades later, the government admitted the drugging and apologized, but questions never stopped. Did the experiment break him, or did someone decide he knew too much? Either way, went wrong isn't strong enough for what happened. Not all experiments were secret because they were clever. Some were secret because they were absurd. In 1962, researchers injected an elephant named Tuskegee with an enormous dose of LSD, hoping to see whether it could trigger mus. Within minutes, the animal collapsed into seizures and died. Later analysis suggested the combination of drugs and panic response medicine may have made it worse, but the outcome is the same. A living creature suffered for a question that never deserved to be asked. And if you think that's dark, there's a reason some history books barely touch Unit 731. During World War II, Japan's Unit 731 operated in occupied China under the cover of a public health facility. In reality, it was a biological warfare program built on human experimentation and mass killing. Prisoners were dehumanized, infected, and used to test weapons and diseases. Near the end of the war, evidence was destroyed, and victims were silenced. The most disturbing twist came after. Many officials avoided prosecution as their data became valuable in Cold War politics. Sometimes an experiment doesn't go wrong. Sometimes it goes exactly as intended. And that's the horror. Not every horror involved weapons. Some involved words. In 1939, the so-called monster study took 22 orphan children and tried to manufacture a speech disorder. Some children who spoke normally were told they were stuttering, criticized, and shamed until they became anxious about speaking at all. The results weren't published for decades, likely because the researchers knew what they had done. When it surfaced in the 2000s, survivors described lifelong effects, proof that suggestion can injure as surely as a blade. Then there were the experiments that treated illness like a tool. In Guatemala in the late 1940s, U.S.-led researchers deliberately infected prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients with STDs to test antibiotics. Some were exposed through arranged encounters, others were infected directly. Many never received proper treatment. The files stayed buried until 2010, when the world learned what had been done and an apology followed. Far too late for many victims. In New York at Willowbrook State School, researchers intentionally infected disabled children with hepatitis from 1956 into the 1970s, arguing the kids would get it anyway in the overcrowded institution. Parents were pressured, consent was muddy, and the children paid the price for knowledge adults wanted without paying the ethical cost. And when the world finally saw what Willowbrook looked like, it became impossible to pretend these were just subjects. They were children who needed protection. Cold War fear also created a project that sounds like a horror headline, Project Sunshine. To measure radioactive fallout, officials collected bone and tissue samples from deceased infants and children, often without meaningful permission, so scientists could track strontium-90. Even when the science question was real, the method shredded public trust. Across the Atlantic, Porton Down in Britain tested nerve agents on soldiers. In 1953, a young serviceman, Ronald Madison, was exposed to liquid sarin and died. Decades later, a jury ruled it an unlawful killing. Secrecy didn't protect the truth forever. It only delayed it. And finally, the modern era proved we haven't outgrown the temptation. In 2018, a scientist announced the first gene-edited babies using CRISPR, done in secrecy, with shaky oversight, and with consequences no one can fully predict. He was later imprisoned, but the children will live with an experiment written into their DNA. So what ties all of this together? It isn't the technology, it's the mindset. When people believe the mission matters more than the person, ethics becomes optional. And once ethics becomes optional, the pattern repeats. Test first, explain later, bury the files, and hope time erases the outrage. The scariest part is not what we know happened. It's what might still be sitting in a file drawer, waiting for someone brave enough to open it. For more such content, like and subscribe.